You are standing outside and there is no roof over your head, no fire lit yet, and the temperature has dropped low enough that your bare skin has maybe a few hours before it starts shutting down for good. There is no store nearby. There is no blanket. There is nothing waiting for you except cold and more cold, stretching for months. That was not a hypothetical for most of human history. That was Tuesday. For hundreds of thousands of years, ancient humans lived through winters that could kill an unprotected person in a matter of hours, in parts of the world without heating, without modern shelter, without any guarantee that spring would actually arrive for them personally. And yet, here you are, which means, somewhere back down that line, your ancestors figured something out. So the real question isn't whether they survived, obviously they did. Real question is how, and the answer turns out to be far stranger and far more collaborative than most people assume. Let's start with fire, because fire is the foundation everything else gets built on. The earliest hearths we have solid evidence for date back at least 790,000 years, and some researchers believe cooking itself may stretch back as far as 1.5 million years. By around 500,000 years ago, the evidence for actual campfires gets much clearer, and somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago, regular fire use becomes a defining feature of how early humans lived. Fire did the obvious thing. It kept people warm, but it also did something people don't usually think about, which is that it extended the day itself, pushing back the hours when a group could see, cook, and stay active after the sun went down. And fire wasn't just a survival tool used carelessly. Neanderthals, specifically, demonstrated a level of control over fire that goes well beyond just keeping warm. They used it to produce birch pitch glue, a material, you said, in tool making that requires precise, sustained temperature control to actually work. That is not a species huddled around flames hoping for the best. That is a species that had learned to manipulate heat with real technical skill, but fire alone doesn't get you through a winter. You also need to stop losing the heat fire gives you, which is where clothing comes in. Humans were using bear hides for cold protection for at least 300,000 years, which happens to be the oldest known use of bear resources found anywhere in the world. Hides and fur functioned as wind and waterproof clothing, which matters more than it sounds like it should, because wind is often what actually kills you in the cold, not just low temperature on its own. We also have bone tools dated to somewhere between 120,000 and 90,000 years ago that were specifically used for processing hides into usable material. And if you want a strikingly specific image of what this actually looked like, there are 24,000-year-old carved ivory figurines out of Russia that depict people wearing fur parkas. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, carved a small object specifically to show off what their winter coat looked like. So, fire, plus clothing, plus shelter. Ancient humans used caves throughout the Paleolithic period for sleeping, cooking, and general daily life. But they weren't only relying on natural shelter either. There's a reconstructed shelter from a site called Terra Amata in France, dated to around 400,000 years ago, that shows early humans were also actively constructing their own shelters, rather than simply waiting to find a convenient cave. And then there's food, because staying warm keeps you alive for a night, but winter is long, and starving to death is just a slower version of freezing to death. In colder regions, ancient hominins leaned more heavily on animal prey, specifically because meat and fat provided the dense calories needed to survive harsh conditions, a pattern we still see today in modern foraging societies living in similar climates. And this is where one of the more genuinely surprising facts in this whole story shows up. Humans were storing food for later consumption as early as 400,000 years ago, using pits, placing food under rocks, or submerging it in bogs, sometimes deliberately fermenting it in the process. That number should stop you for a second. 400,000 years ago, long before agriculture, long before permanent settlements as we usually picture them, ancient humans were already thinking ahead, planning for scarcity before it hit, which is a level of foresight that doesn't fit the usual mental image of primitive people, just reacting moment to moment. Now, here's where the story usually gets oversimplified, and it's worth slowing down and correcting it directly, because there's a common assumption that ancient humans survived winter purely through technology, fire, clothes, shelter, and nothing else. That their bodies themselves were basically identical to ours, unadapted, relying entirely on outside tools to compensate. That's not quite the full picture. Neanderthals specifically carried real biological adaptations to cold climates: stocky limbs, broad noses, a distinct facial structure. Computer simulations of Neanderthal nasal anatomy suggest their nasal passages were genuinely efficient at conditioning cold air before it reached the lungs, conserving both heat and moisture in the process. They were also more muscular, carried higher fat content, and researchers estimate they needed somewhere between 3,360 and 4,480 calories a day just to fuel that level of cold resistance and the demanding physical work of winter foraging. So it wasn't only clever tool use keeping people alive. Evolution itself had started shaping bodies specifically for the environment they were surviving in. And there's a second assumption worth correcting here too, which is the idea that ancient humans, especially in brutal winters, were basically isolated and solitary, just individually gritting out survival. The evidence points the other way. Early humans gathered at hearths specifically to eat and to socialize together. And there's a broader theory called seasonal aggregation, where different hunter-gatherer groups would come together at specific times of year for social bonding, for sharing resources, and for finding mates, particularly during periods when resources were either scarce or unusually abundant. Winter, in other words, didn't isolate people. In many cases, it may have pulled them closer together. Now, here's the part of this story that gets genuinely strange, and it's important to be upfront that this one is far from settled. In 2020, a study published in the journal Anthropology proposed something that sounds almost too strange to take seriously at first. Researchers looking at hominin remains from a site in Spain called Cima de los Huesos, dated back roughly 500,000 years, found bone damage patterns, lesions, evidence consistent with rickets, chronic kidney disease, hyperparathyroidism, disorders affecting bone and mineral balance, arranged in cycles that suggested repeated interruptions in growth and healing. Their proposal was that this pattern is consistent with a kind of metabolic slowdown, something functionally similar to hibernation, as a way of surviving through winters when food was scarce. To be clear, this is a heavily debated theory, and it should be treated that way rather than as settled fact. Critics point out that hibernating species tend to be small-bodied and that humans, at the size and metabolic scale we're talking about, may simply be too large for true hibernation to work as a survival strategy. The researchers behind the original study aren't claiming certainty either. As of now, whether any ancient human population actually slowed their bodies down anything like this remains genuinely unknown and needs a lot more evidence before anyone can call it confirmed. There's also ongoing debate around something a little more grounded, which is whether differences in clothing use might partly explain why early modern humans outcompeted Neanderthals over time. Some researchers propose that modern humans developed tailored, closely fitted, more insulating clothing, while Neanderthals may have relied on simpler, looser, cape-like coverings that provided less protection. This idea is still being explored, and the fine details of exactly how ancient clothing was constructed, what full range of materials were used, and how effective the insulation actually was, remain largely unknown. It's an open thread, not a closed case. So, what do you do with all of this? A species that mastered fire well enough to control precise temperatures for tool making, but wore tailored fur clothing at least 300,000 years ago. That built its own shelters rather than only relying on caves. That was storing food for lean months as early as 400,000 years ago. That may have carried real physical adaptations to cold, and that, in at least one debated and unresolved case, might have slowed its own body down to wait out the worst of it. And through all of that, still gathered at the fire specifically to be around each other, not despite the cold, but sometimes because of it. None of these were separate solutions operating in isolation. Fire, clothing, shelter, food storage, biology, and social gathering all worked as a single overlapping system, each piece covering for the gaps in the others. That's not really a story about individual toughness. It's a story about layered problem solving, stacked generation after generation, long before anyone was writing any of it down. We still don't fully know if some part of that ancient winter survival system involved something as strange as a slowed hibernation-like state. We still don't fully know the exact construction of the clothing that kept people alive at minus temperatures with nothing but hide and bone needles. And we still don't fully understand the social rules that govern those seasonal gatherings, where scattered groups came back together in the hardest months of the year. But maybe that unfinished quality is the actual point. Winter, for nearly the entire span of human existence, was not a season you simply endured alone. It was a problem you solved collectively, with fire, with fur, with stored food, with bodies that had been slowly reshaped by cold itself, and with other people sitting close enough to share the heat. We like to imagine our ancestors as isolated figures fighting nature one-on-one. The evidence keeps suggesting something quieter and more interesting instead, that the real survival strategy was never just resistance to the cold. It was refusing to face it by yourself.